Most planets in the Star Wars galaxy follow the same basic rules. They have a molten core, a rocky surface, and whatever lives on top figures it out from there. Naboo threw every single one of those rules out the window. This planet formed as something that scientists across the galaxy could not explain. Where other worlds had a ball of liquid fire at their center, Naboo had nothing of the sort. The inside of this planet was hollow. Picture a massive underground maze made of rock, stretching in every direction, with tunnels and caverns stacked on top of each other for thousands of miles. And running through all of it were two things: water and plasma. Actual rivers of energy flowing through the guts of this world like a second circulatory system. The entire interior of Naboo was basically a flooded cave network laced with raw, naturally occurring power. Astrophysicists who studied the planet had no framework to explain how something like this could form. Every model they had for how terrestrial planets were supposed to work fell apart when they looked at Naboo. The honeycomb structure of its interior, the underground lakes, the plasma veins running through solid rock. None of it made sense by conventional science. Naboo was a geological puzzle that nobody could solve. And then you get to the surface, which told a completely different story. Above all of that underground chaos sat one of the most peaceful-looking worlds you could ever find. Swampy lakes fed into rolling green hills. Grasslands stretched for miles in every direction. The air was clean, the water was fresh, and life had taken hold everywhere you looked. Over millions of years, an entire ecosystem built itself up across the planet. Gentle creatures called sharks wandered the open plains in herds, grazing on tall grass without a care in the world. They were slow, calm animals that looked like they belonged on a nature documentary about the most relaxing place in the galaxy. The hills were covered in thick green vegetation, and rivers cut through wide valleys before emptying into massive lakes that dotted the landscape. From orbit, Naboo looked like a painting. Bright greens, deep blues, soft clouds. Everything about the surface suggested a world that was perfectly safe and perfectly boring. But the surface was only half of the picture. Beneath the lakes and oceans, things got dark fast. Naboo's underwater world was home to some of the most terrifying predators the galaxy had ever produced. The OP sea killer was a massive deep-sea hunter that used a long, sticky tongue to snatch prey from a distance before dragging it into rows of teeth. The Colo clawfish was built even more aggressively. That thing had massive pincers mounted on the front of its body and could paralyze anything it grabbed with a single squeeze. And then sitting at the very top of the food chain was the Sando aqua monster. This creature was so large that it could swallow the other two whole without slowing down. We are talking about an animal that made everything else in Naboo's oceans look small by comparison. These were not rare sightings either. The deep waters of Naboo were packed with these giants, and they had been thriving down there for longer than anyone could track. The deeper you went into Naboo's oceans, the bigger and more dangerous the life forms became. This planet's food chain was stacked in a way that rewarded size and aggression at every level below the surface. So you had this world with a beautiful, calm exterior. Green fields, quiet lakes, soft breezes. And then directly underneath all of that, you had flooded tunnels full of plasma energy and oceans crawling with predators the size of starships. Naboo was a planet of extremes that hid everything dangerous beneath a pretty face. What you saw from the surface told you almost nothing about what was actually going on with this world. Now here is where it gets interesting. Because Naboo was not just home to animals. Long before any human ever set foot on this world, long before anyone in the wider galaxy even knew the planet existed, an intelligent species had already claimed it. The Gungans. These amphibious beings were the first sentient life forms to evolve on Naboo, and they did not build their world on the surface. They built it underneath. The Gungans adapted to the marshes and waterways that covered huge portions of the planet. They could breathe underwater and move through swamps as easily as most species walk down a road. Over thousands of years, they spread across Naboo's wetlands and began developing the foundations of a real civilization. Language, tools, social structure, all of it came together in the murky waters beneath the surface. While the grasslands above sat empty and wild, the Gungans were laying the groundwork for something that would eventually become one of the most unique cultures in the entire galaxy. Their world was completely hidden from view. Anyone flying over Naboo in those early days would have seen nothing but nature. Green hills, open water, herds of sharks. They would have had no idea that beneath the surface of those calm lakes, an entire intelligent society was taking shape. And the thing that tied all of this together, the thing that would eventually turn Naboo from a quiet backwater into one of the most important planets in the galaxy, was already there from the very beginning. That plasma running through the planet's core was not just a geological curiosity. It was energy, real, usable, incredibly potent energy in liquid form. Plasma on Naboo could be refined and turned into fuel for starships. It could power entire reactor systems. It could be loaded into weapons. In terms of raw energy output, the stuff flowing through Naboo's underground tunnels was worth more than most mining operations across the mid-rim combined. But in those primordial days, nobody was using it. The plasma just sat there, building up in underground reservoirs, running through tunnels, pooling in caverns deep below the surface. The Gungans lived alongside it without ever tapping into its full potential. The wider galaxy had no idea the resource even existed. For millions of years, this energy source just accumulated beneath the crust, waiting. Naboo was sitting on a fortune that could reshape economies and fuel entire fleets, and not a single soul in the galaxy knew about it. For now, Naboo existed in a kind of untouched balance. The surface belonged to the animals. The underwater world belonged to the Gungans. The plasma belonged to no one. And the planet just kept spinning, beautiful and strange and full of secrets, waiting for the rest of the galaxy to finally notice it. That wait would not last forever. Here is something most people do not realize about the Gungans. They did not start underwater. Biologists who studied the species believe they originally evolved as land dwellers. Ancient Gungan artifacts have been found scattered across Naboo's surface, tools and carvings left behind in dirt and stone, from a time when the Gungans lived above ground. In their earliest days, they roamed the plains as nomadic tribes, moving from camp to camp and leaving behind traces of a culture that stretched back further than almost anyone expected. One of the most telling pieces of evidence were the Gung slabs. These were stone tablets carved in both Old Gungan and Galactic Basic, hinting at a civilization that had been developing language and record-keeping for thousands of years before their story ever intersected with the rest of the galaxy. But living on the surface of Naboo was not easy. The planet's wildlife was aggressive and relentless, and the Gungans were forced to fight for survival from the very beginning. Legends passed down through generations talk about an ancient ice age when packs of woolly Veermoks terrorized Gungan camps. These creatures hunted in groups and were strong enough to overwhelm entire settlements if the Gungans were not prepared. The Veermoks were dangerous, but they were not the worst thing the Gungans had to deal with. That title belonged to the Bursas. These predators targeted Gungan communities over and over again, attacking with a kind of persistence that forced the Gungans to change the way they lived. Scattered tribes could not survive repeated assaults like that. So the Gungans did something they had never done before. They came together. Tribes that had been independent for generations joined forces and formed what became known as the Grand Army. They developed real weapons, organized their fighters, and went on the offensive. The campaign against the Bursas was long and brutal. But the Gungans eventually succeeded. They drove the Bursas all the way to extinction. Every last one of them was wiped from the planet. That fight shaped the Gungans at a fundamental level. It turned them into a warrior culture that valued courage and toughness above almost everything else. Survival was not something they took for granted. They earned it. With the surface growing more dangerous and their warrior identity solidified, the Gungans began developing technology unlike anything else in the galaxy. Where most civilizations built their tools and structures out of metal and stone, the Gungans grew theirs. Their entire approach to technology was organic. They coaxed natural materials into the shapes and functions they needed, working with Naboo's biology instead of against it. Weapons, vehicles, buildings, all of it was grown. This philosophy produced one of their greatest achievements. The Gungans figured out how to create hydrostatic force fields, energy barriers that could hold back water and create pockets of dry, breathable space underneath lakes and oceans. They used these bubble-shaped shields to carve out entire living areas beneath the surface of the water. Inside each bubble, they grew structures from local fauna, building habitats that looked like they were part of the aquatic environment itself. From a distance, a Gungan city looked like it belonged there, almost like a natural formation. This technology changed everything for them, because around this same period, something arrived on Naboo that the Gungans had never encountered before. Off-worlders. An alien reptilian species showed up on the planet, and Gungan lore remembers them only as the Elders. These beings were not explorers or traders. They came to colonize Naboo, and they brought advanced technology that the Gungans could not match. A war broke out between the two species, and the Gungans found themselves outgunned in ways they had never experienced. Fighting predators and rival tribes was one thing. Going up against an advanced alien force with superior weapons was something else entirely. The Elders pushed the Gungans off the surface, driving them further and further from the lands they had roamed for centuries. Faced with a fight they could not win on land, the Gungans made a decision that would define their civilization forever. They retreated underwater. Using the hydrostatic bubble technology they had already developed, they relocated their entire society beneath Naboo's lakes and seas. The cavernous underwater world that had always been part of their environment now became their permanent home. And as it turned out, the conditions down there were more than livable. Edible plants like the gala grew in abundance, and gumfish provided a steady source of food. The Gungans were not just surviving underwater, they were thriving. As for the Elders, they vanished. Just as suddenly as they had appeared, they disappeared from Naboo entirely. Nobody knows where they went or why they left. The only evidence they ever existed at all were a handful of stone statues scattered across the surface, silent reminders of a conflict that had reshaped Gungan society from the ground up. The Gungans never went back to the surface. The world above was no longer theirs, and they had no interest in reclaiming it. Their future was underwater now. But even in their new domain, peace did not come easily. The Gungans were spread across dozens of underwater settlements, and without a common enemy to unite them, old rivalries resurfaced. Different tribes and city-states began fighting each other for territory, resources, and dominance beneath the waves. Around 3000 BBY, these tensions boiled over into a series of full-scale tribal wars. Gungan fought Gungan across the underwater expanse, and for a while it looked like the species might tear itself apart from the inside. That changed because of one leader. A Gungan named Boss Gallo rose to power during this chaos, and he did something no one else had been able to do. Through a combination of battlefield victories and genuine diplomacy, Gallo brought the warring factions together. He defeated the most dangerous warlord standing in his way, a rival leader named Boss Rogo, and then rallied the remaining tribes under a single banner. On the site of the final battle, Gallo founded a new city. He called it Oto Gunga, and it became the capital of a unified Gungan nation. Under Gallo and the leaders who followed him, Gungan society stabilized into something real and lasting. A boss sat at the top of the government, advised by a high council made up of representatives from across the population. They maintained the Grand Army as a permanent standing force, equipped now with advanced gear, shield generators that could protect entire formations on the battlefield, electropole shock lances for close combat, and plasma energy boomers, spherical grenades that weaponized the very energy flowing through Naboo's core. The Gungans were no longer just survivors. They were an organized, well-armed civilization with a military that could defend their territory against anything that came their way. Even so, the Gungans kept to themselves. After everything they had been through, from the Bursars to the Elders to their own civil wars, they had no desire to spread beyond their underwater domain. The open grasslands and mountains above the surface were practically foreign territory to them. They saw those dry, open spaces the same way a desert dweller might look at an ocean, uninviting and unnecessary. So, for centuries, the Gungans stayed in the swamps, rivers, and underwater cities they had built, leaving the vast majority of Naboo's surface completely wild and untouched. The only sentient inhabitants of the planet had chosen to live beneath it, and the sprawling green world above was left wide open. That empty surface was about to become very important. Around 4000 BBY, while the Gungans lived quietly beneath the lakes, something fell from the sky. A ship from the core world of Grismalt came crashing down onto Naboo's surface, carrying a group of refugees who had fled their homeworld to survive. Grismalt was tearing itself apart in a civil war, and these people had no intention of going back. They were led by an explorer named Quillan, and when they stepped out onto Naboo's open plains and saw what surrounded them, they knew they had found something special. Clean air, green land as far as they could see, fresh water everywhere. After coming from a planet consumed by fighting, this place must have felt like a different universe entirely. They named the world Naboo, after one of their own deities back on Grismalt. Over time, that name shifted into the spelling we know today, Naboo, and the people who landed there started building a new life from nothing. Those early years were rough. The Grismalti refugees did not have cities or infrastructure waiting for them. They lived the way early settlers always do, moving from place to place in small groups, learning the terrain as they went. They pushed through the Gallo Mountains, scouting for areas where they could actually grow food and put down roots. Eventually, they found what they were looking for. One of the first real settlements went up at a place called Dija Peak, a highland location where the colonists built a farming community and rigged up wind turbines to generate power. It was simple, but it worked. From there, the expansion picked up speed. New villages started appearing across the plains and lake country, each one built around whatever natural resource was nearby. Some groups settled along the banks of the Solu River. Others moved toward the northern ocean coast. Every settlement started small, just a handful of families working the land. But over generations, those tiny farming communities grew. Hamlets turned into towns. Towns turned into something bigger. Eventually, these scattered human communities evolved into full city-states, each one with its own local leaders and its own way of doing things. The people who had arrived as Grismalti refugees were becoming something new. They stopped identifying with their old homeworld and started calling themselves the Naboo, taking the planet's name as their own. Culturally, and even genetically, they were drifting further from their Grismalti ancestors with every passing generation. The The children born on Naboo had no memory of civil war or the cramped cities their parents had escaped from. Their entire world was open fields, clean water, and the promise of more land just over the next hill. A distinct identity was forming around this planet, and it had nothing to do with where these people came from. It was entirely about where they were now. Now here is where things get complicated. Because the humans were not alone on this planet, and they knew it. When the Grismalti first landed, the Gungans noticed. Gungan records from that era describe the moment clearly. The amphibious natives saw the off-worlders arrive and made a deliberate choice. They pulled back. Entire Gungan communities that had been living near the surface retreated deeper underwater and stayed out of sight. They had dealt with invaders before, and their instinct was to disappear. So for a brief window of time, the two species existed on the same planet without really crossing paths. The humans spread across the surface. The Gungans stayed below. Two civilizations on one world, each living as if the other did not exist. That separation could not hold. As the human population grew and their settlements pushed further into the plains and swamplands, contact became unavoidable. The first encounters between the two species were careful. Neither side started swinging right away. Historical accounts actually suggest that diplomats from both groups tried to open communication once they realized they were sharing the planet. The humans were genuinely fascinated to discover an intelligent amphibious species living beneath the surface. The Gungans, cautious by nature after everything they had been through, were curious about these strange newcomers who had dropped out of the sky. There were even brief stretches of something resembling peace. Legends describe isolated cases where Gungans traded food or small pieces of technology with human pioneers who had wandered close to the swamps. For a short time, it seemed like the two peoples might actually figure out how to coexist. That hope did not last. The problem was space. Every new human village that went up meant more land being claimed, more rivers being redirected, more swamp edges being pushed back. The colonists needed room to grow, and they were expanding into territory the Gungans considered theirs. Cultural differences made everything worse. The humans looked at the Gungans and saw creatures they considered primitive. Animals, basically. The Gungans looked at the humans and saw greedy outsiders grabbing everything they could reach. Neither side understood the other, and neither side was willing to bend. Small conflicts started breaking out across the frontier. A Gungan hunting party running into human farmers in disputed territory. Humans trying to dam a river that Gungan communities depended on for survival. Each incident was minor on its own, but they stacked up fast. The diplomatic channels that had opened early on went cold. Talks broke down. Distrust replaced curiosity. And within just a few decades of the humans arriving, the relationship between the two species had turned hostile. What followed was exactly what you would expect when two civilizations fight over the same land and neither one is willing to leave. Starting around 3900 BBY, a series of wars erupted between the human colonists and the Gungans. These were not small border disputes anymore. They were organized, sustained conflicts fought over control of arable land and critical swamp territory. The Gungans knew the wetlands better than anyone and had a warrior tradition stretching back thousands of years. The humans were determined and growing in numbers every generation. Archaeological evidence found on Naboo's surface, combined with Gungan oral histories passed down through the centuries, paint a picture of a devastating back and forth that went on for generations. Entire human villages were swallowed by the swamps during Gungan counterattacks. In return, human forces burned Gungan holy sites that sat above ground. Sacred places that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash. Both sides won battles and both sides lost them, but the fighting never produced a clear winner. Neither species could push the other off the planet completely. The wars just kept going, decade after decade, draining both populations while solving nothing. Naboo had gone from an untouched paradise to a war zone, and the two species that called it home were locked in a fight that neither one could finish. The wars could not go on forever. Eventually, both sides ran out of the will to keep fighting. Leaders on both sides tried to stop it. Diplomats from the human settlements and representatives from the Gungan communities met multiple times to negotiate some kind of peace. But every attempt fell apart. The mistrust between the two species had become so deep that even the best efforts of peacekeepers were sabotaged by extremists on both sides. Hardliners who wanted the fighting to continue actively undermined the talks. Agreements that were close to being signed got torn up. Truces that were nearly reached collapsed before they could take hold. The people who wanted peace could never get enough support, and the people who wanted war always found a way to reignite it. In the end, the fighting did not stop because someone won. It stopped because everyone was exhausted. After decades of conflict, both the humans and the Gungans were drained. The losses, the destroyed communities, the constant state of alert. None of it had produced a winner, and both sides finally accepted that neither one was going to drive the other off the planet. So they did the only thing left. They agreed to stay away from each other. The terms were unwritten, but understood by everyone. The humans would keep the surface. The Gungans would keep the underwater world. Each species would stay in their own territory, and contact between the two would stop. No trade, no diplomacy, no interaction at all. The planet would be split into two separate realms, and the people living in each one would pretend the other did not exist. It was a cold, hard agreement born out of pure exhaustion, and it changed the course of Naboo's history for thousands of years. The Gungans moved first. Every Gungan community that still had any presence near the surface pulled out completely. Settlements that had existed in wetlands and along riverbanks for generations were packed up and relocated underwater. The overland routes that had once connected different Gungan territories were abandoned. The few Gungans who might have been spotted on land disappeared entirely. Oto Gunga and the smaller underwater cities became completely self-sufficient, drawing everything they needed from the aquatic ecosystem around them. Food, materials, energy, all of it came from beneath the water. The Gungans had no reason to go to the surface anymore, and after what the humans had done to their holy sites and their people, they had no desire to either. To anyone watching from above, the Gungans ceased to exist. The lakes went quiet, the swamps emptied. An entire civilization vanished from view. The humans took notice and did exactly what you would expect. With the Gungans gone from sight, the Naboo spread across every continent on the planet. They claimed the best locations for their cities without consulting anyone. Swamps were drained, open plains were cleared and converted into farmland. Roads went up connecting one city-state to the next, and the infrastructure of a real surface civilization took shape. Generation after generation, the Naboo expanded and built, treating the planet as if it belonged to them alone. And over time, they started to forget. The Gungans had been a formidable enemy during the wars. Their technology was advanced, their warriors were fierce, and their knowledge of Naboo's terrain was unmatched. But as the centuries passed, with zero contact, the humans slowly lost their understanding of what the Gungans actually were. The rare glimpse of a Gungan near a lake or swamp edge was treated like a sighting of some strange animal. Human children grew up hearing stories about monsters living in the water, not about an intelligent civilization with cities and armies and a culture older than anything on the surface. The Naboo stopped seeing the Gungans as equals. they stopped seeing them as a threat. Eventually, most humans dismissed them entirely as a primitive species that lived in the mud and was not worth thinking about. The Gungans were building their own version of the story at the same time. Beneath the water, Gungan elders taught their young that the surface dwellers were pompous and weak, cowards who hid behind high city walls because they could not survive in the real world. The humans could not swim, could not hunt, could not handle themselves in the swamps or the open water. As far as the Gungans were concerned, the Naboo were soft outsiders, playing at civilization on land that the Gungans had originally called home. These attitudes hardened with every generation that passed without contact. Insults became tradition. Prejudice became culture. This is what Naboo looked like for thousands of years. Two complete civilizations living on the same planet, separated by nothing more than water, and each one convinced the other was beneath them. Human historical texts from this era barely mentioned the Gungans at all. When they did come up, it was usually in the context of old fairy tales about creatures lurking in the lakes. Gungan oral history warned its people to stay away from the dangerous outsiders above. Neither side had any real understanding of what the other had built, how they lived, or what they were capable of. The divide was total. Two societies developing side by side in complete isolation, sharing a world but sharing nothing else. The elegant cities that the Naboo were constructing on the surface had no connection to the organic underwater metropolises the Gungans were expanding below. Two cultures, two governments, two ways of life, and a wall of water and pride between them that nobody on either side had any interest in tearing down. The real cost of this division would not become obvious for a long time, but when a genuine threat eventually arrived on Naboo, one that required every fighter and every resource the planet could muster, the humans and the Gungans would find themselves completely unable to work together. They had spent so many centuries apart that they had forgotten how. The schism left Naboo looking whole from the outside, but it was cracked right down the middle in a way that made the entire planet vulnerable. That vulnerability was going to matter, because Naboo was about to enter an era that would test it in ways neither species could have predicted. With the Gungans gone from the surface and no outside forces threatening the planet, you would think the humans of Naboo would have thrived. Instead, they turned on each other. The city-states that had spread across the planet started competing for prestige, territory, and resources. Without a common enemy to worry about, old rivalries between settlements boiled over into open fighting. Nobles challenged nobles. Cities attacked neighboring cities. What began as political disagreements escalated into a full-scale planetary civil war that tore through the human population for generations. Naboo's own historians would later call this period the time of suffering, and the name was earned. The entire human civilization fragmented into petty kingdoms and fiefdoms, each one fighting for dominance over the others. Off-worlders rarely visited Naboo during this era, so there was nobody to step in and broker peace. The fighting was entirely internal, entirely self-inflicted, and it went on long enough that entire generations grew up knowing nothing but conflict. Everything the colonists had built since landing on the planet was being torn apart by the very people who built it. Then came Jaffan. He was a general, not a politician, and he did something that no leader on Naboo had managed before him. Around 832 BBY, Jaffan launched a campaign to end the civil war permanently. Through a combination of battlefield victories and negotiated surrenders, he systematically brought the warring factions to heel. Rival princes who would not surrender were defeated. Those willing to talk were given terms they could accept. One by one, the petty kingdoms fell in line until the entire human population of Naboo was unified under a single banner for the first time since the original colonists had landed. Jaffan declared himself king of all Naboo and ushered in what became known as the Great Time of Peace. But Jafan was not just a conqueror, he was a builder. Instead of ruling from one of the existing city-states, which would have played favorites and sparked resentment, he decided to create something entirely new. He chose a site along the cliffs above the Solu River for a brand new capital city. The location was already home to a thriving farming village, populated by settlers who had fled the wars and found good land near the water. Jafan's engineers began transforming that village into something much grander. They built the Theed Royal Palace directly on top of a sheer cliff face overlooking a massive waterfall, and they designed the rest of the city to radiate outward from the palace in every direction. The idea was that the monarch's home would sit at the heart of the skyline, visible from everywhere in the city, a permanent reminder that Naboo was united under one leader. The city they built was stunning. Buildings went up in honey-colored stone with green shingled domed roofs, giving the entire capital a warm, harmonious look that felt like it had grown naturally out of the landscape. Grand boulevards cut through the city center. Gardens were woven between government buildings and public spaces. Bridges arched over the river, connecting different districts with walkways that doubled as gathering spots for citizens. Theed looked like it belonged in a storybook, and that was the point. Jafan wanted a capital that would inspire his people and prove that the wars were over for good. What most visitors never realized was what sat beneath the city. Jafan's engineers took advantage of Naboo's porous crust and built an entire network of underground tunnels running below Theed. These served as maintenance corridors and emergency escape routes, carefully engineered and maintained for generations. The tunnels were not public knowledge, but they were always kept in working condition. If the city ever came under attack, there would be a way out that most enemies would never find. With Theed established as the capital, Jafan turned his attention to reshaping Naboo's entire culture. After watching his people destroy themselves in a pointless civil war, he made a deliberate decision to steer the Naboo away from anything resembling militarism. The society he built was founded on art, education, and diplomacy. Scholars and philosophers were elevated to the highest levels of respect. Architects who designed beautiful buildings were treated with the same admiration that generals had received during the wars. Jafan and the kings who followed him poured resources into institutions that would anchor this new way of life. The Royal House of Learning opened its doors as a center for education and civic study. The University of Theed followed, drawing students from across the Mid-Rim who came to study under Naboo's finest minds. The capital itself became a cultural powerhouse. The Theed Opera House and Music Hall hosted performances that attracted visitors from distant systems. Museums filled with classical art and sculpture opened alongside the university. Festivals celebrating peace became annual traditions that the entire planet participated in. Naboo developed a reputation across the galaxy as a world of thinkers, artists, and diplomats. The people prided themselves on settling disagreements through debate and reason in planetary councils and forums. Fighting was seen as a failure, not a solution. This did not mean Naboo abandoned all forms of defense. They kept a modest security force on hand for basic protection, but the emphasis was always on keeping the peace through conversation. The entire society had made a conscious choice. They had seen what war did to their world during the time of suffering, and they were never going back to it. King Jafan ruled for a long time, and when he eventually passed, the framework he had built outlived him. Naboo stayed unified under one central government based in Theed, with regional administrators handling local affairs, but all of them pledging loyalty to the throne. Then in 867 BBY, Naboo took a step that changed its place in the galaxy forever. The planet officially joined the Galactic Republic, the ancient democratic union that connected star systems across the galaxy. For Naboo, this was a crowning achievement. The day was celebrated so deeply that it became an annual tradition known as the Festival of Light, held every year after, to mark the anniversary. Republic membership opened up Naboo to wider commerce and diplomacy. The planet began trading its plasma energy and fine artwork with other worlds, building economic relationships that brought new wealth and recognition. Naboo also earned a seat in the Galactic Senate, sending a senator to represent the Chomel sector on Coruscant. Over the centuries that followed, Naboo became known as a model Republic world, a prosperous, stable planet that contributed to galactic culture without getting pulled into military conflicts. The Naboo wielded influence in the Senate through their reputation and their cultural contributions, not through fleets or armies. The great time of peace stretched on for hundreds of years, with barely any disruption. The surface of the planet saw virtually no warfare during that entire span. For centuries, the plasma running through Naboo's underground had been nothing more than a geological curiosity. The Naboo people knew it was there, but tapping into it safely was another problem entirely. Plasma was volatile, unpredictable, and buried deep inside a network of flooded caverns that could collapse without warning. Getting it out of the ground required technology that did not exist during Naboo's early history. That changed in the final centuries of the Republic. Naboo engineers developed specialized plasma drills capable of reaching the subterranean veins that crisscrossed the planet's crust. Alongside the drills, they created containment fields that could hold the extracted plasma without it destabilizing during transport. These were not simple tools. Plasma extraction on Naboo was a precise science that took generations of refinement before it became reliable enough to scale. But once the process was working, the results were staggering. Refined Naboo plasma turned out to be one of the most valuable energy sources in the galaxy. It could fuel hyperdrives on long-range starships. It served as core material for reactor systems. Weapons manufacturers discovered it could be loaded into plasmatic torpedoes with devastating effect. The substance was so energy-dense and so versatile that demand for it spread across the mid-rim and beyond. Other planets in the region had nothing comparable. Naboo was sitting on something genuinely rare, and now they had the means to harvest it. The leadership in Theed handled the new industry carefully. Plasma mining was placed under strict government control, with regulations designed to protect the planet's ecology and prevent dangerous cave-ins beneath the surface. Extraction rates were monitored, safety protocols were enforced at every stage, and in a move that perfectly captured the Naboo mindset, the refineries and mining operations were deliberately hidden from view. Most facilities were built underground or tucked into remote locations far from populated areas. The three-domed plasma refinery complex in the capital was one of the few visible operations, and even that was designed to blend with Theed's architecture as much as a massive industrial facility could. The Naboo were making a fortune, but they were not about to let it ruin the look of their planet. The money that flowed in from plasma exports transformed Naboo's economy. Shipments went out in specialized containers, purchased primarily by the Republic fleet and major starship manufacturers who needed high-grade fuel. Energy credits poured into Theed's treasury, and the standard of living across the planet climbed steadily. New construction went up in the capital. Cultural programs expanded. The University of Theed and other institutions received increased funding. All of this happened without Naboo having to industrialize the way most wealthy worlds did. There were no smokestacks, no factory districts, no sprawling mining towns. The wealth came from underground and was reinvested into the things the Naboo cared about most: art, education, and the elegant way of life they had built since the days of King Jafan. That wealth drew attention from exactly the wrong people. Off-world corporations had been watching Naboo's plasma output grow for years, and the biggest player among them was the Trade Federation. This was not a regular trading company. The Federation operated its own fleet of battleships and maintained a standing droid army. They were a corporate power with military capability, and they had been circling Naboo for some time. The relationship between Naboo and the Trade Federation deepened during the reign of King Bon Tapalo, who ruled just a few years before Queen Amidala took the throne. Under Tapalo, Naboo entered into a major trade agreement with the Federation and a banking consortium called Damask Holdings. On paper, it looked like a straightforward business deal. Off-world companies would invest in Naboo's plasma industry. Extraction would increase, and everyone would profit. Behind the scenes, the deal was something else entirely. Damask Holdings was run by a figure named Hago Damask. That name meant nothing to most people in the galaxy. But Hago Damask was actually the Sith Lord Darth Plagueis, one of the most dangerous beings alive, and he had orchestrated the entire arrangement. Plagueis wanted access to Naboo's resources and influence over its political structure as part of a much larger plan. The trade agreement gave him both. With new investment pouring in, the plasma refinery complex in Theed was massively expanded. A 3-domed facility went up on what used to be parkland in the capital. Part of the Solu River was actually rerouted to make room for the new infrastructure. Extraction rates jumped, and Naboo's treasury swelled with the profits. But every credit that came in pulled Naboo deeper into a web it did not understand. The planet was now financially tied to the Trade Federation, a corporation that had the firepower to take what it wanted by force. And operating in the background, Darth Plagueis and his apprentice Darth Sidious were positioning Naboo as a key piece in a scheme that went far beyond trade agreements. Sidious was already embedded in Naboo's own political system, serving as the planet's senator on Coruscant under his real name, Palpatine. By 32 BBY, Naboo had everything a planet could want. A booming economy, high living standards, a beautiful capital, and a respected place in the Republic. There is something about Naboo's government that catches most people off guard. The planet had a king or queen sitting on a throne, living in a palace, commanding a security force. By all appearances, it looked like a traditional monarchy. But the person wearing the crown was not born into the role. They were voted in. After King Jaffan's line and the hereditary rulers that followed him, the Naboo eventually noticed a pattern. Kings who inherited the throne from their parents tended to grow comfortable, complacent. The energy and ambition that Jaffan had brought to the role faded with each passing generation of family rule. At some point, a few centuries before the Clone Wars, the Naboo decided to scrap the hereditary system entirely. In its place, they created something unusual, an elective monarchy. The throne would no longer pass from parent to child. Instead, the people of Naboo would choose their ruler through a popular vote. Any citizen could stand for election, though in practice the candidates usually came from the noble class or from careers in public service. The winner served for a set term, and when that term was over, the next monarch was chosen the same way. The transition from bloodline to ballot happened without major conflict, and the new system brought exactly what the Naboo had hoped for. Fresh perspectives on the throne, new ideas, leaders who earned their position through merit and public trust, not just family connections. Here is where Naboo gets truly unusual. The people they elected were almost always young, extremely young. Naboo culture placed enormous value on youthful idealism and what they called inner purity. The belief was that a young ruler, someone who had not spent decades swimming in political deals and compromise, could see the world more clearly and lead with genuine moral conviction. Maturity on Naboo was measured differently than on most worlds. Education and civic contribution mattered far more than age. If a teenager had excelled academically, demonstrated leadership in community programs, and shown real dedication to public welfare, the Naboo saw no reason why that person should not govern an entire planet. The numbers back this up. Queen Padme Amidala was 14 years old when the people of Naboo put her on the throne. Her predecessor, Queen Jamilia, was likely in her early 20s. Later monarchs like Queen Nuyutni and Queen Apailana followed the same pattern. The Naboo were consistently handing the highest office on the planet to teenagers and young adults. And for the most part, it worked. These young rulers brought energy and sincerity to the role that older, more jaded politicians might have lacked. They genuinely cared about their people, often walking through the streets of Theed and engaging directly with citizens, as opposed to hiding behind layers of protocol. The system was not without risk, though. A 14-year-old on a throne, no matter how intelligent, is still a 14-year-old. These young monarchs were politically inexperienced in ways that left them open to manipulation by people who had spent their entire lives mastering the game. Naboo's own history proves this. Palpatine, who had grown up in the Naboo political system and understood its every weakness, was able to maneuver around the planet's young leaders with ease. An older, more battle-hardened ruler might have seen through his games. The teenagers on the throne did not stand a chance. Still, the Naboo did not leave their young rulers entirely on their own. The monarch governed with the help of a royal advisory council made up of experienced elder statesmen, scholars, and representatives from across the planet's districts. During Amidala's reign, that council included Co Bibble, the governor of Theed, who served as a key advisor and handled much of the capital's day-to-day administration. Beyond the council, there was a full legislative assembly that functioned as a parliament, ensuring that citizens from different regions had a voice in how the planet was run. The monarch held significant executive power, especially when it came to foreign policy and defense, but they were not making decisions in a vacuum. Courts of justice handled legal matters. Ministries managed everything from education to the sciences to trade guilds. The government of Naboo was layered and functional, designed to support a young ruler with the institutional knowledge they might lack personally. One tradition tied all of this together in a way that no other planet in the galaxy replicated: the Legislative Youth Program. This was essentially a political internship built directly into the Naboo education system. Almost every young person on the planet participated in it at some point during their schooling. Students learned civic duty firsthand, working alongside real government officials and getting exposure to how laws were made and enforced. The program served as a pipeline for future leaders, identifying talented young people early and funneling them toward careers in public service. Padme Amidala herself was a product of this system. Before she ever sat on the throne, she had already served as a junior legislator through the youth program. By the time the people elected her queen at 14, she had more practical government experience than some politicians twice her age on other worlds. Beneath all of this civic structure sat the planet's only armed force, the Royal Naboo Security Forces, known as the RNSF, operated directly under the monarch's command. The force was broken into 3 branches. The Royal Naboo Security Guard handled policing and law enforcement. The Royal Palace Guard protected the throne and key government buildings. And the Royal Naboo Space Fighter Corps flew the planet's fleet of sleek N-1 starfighters, Nubian-built ships that were fast and agile, but designed for patrol and defense. The entire RNSF numbered somewhere between 10 and 15,000 personnel. For a planet the size of Naboo, that was barely enough to function as a police force, let alone an army. Officers like Captain Panaka and later Captain Typho did their best with what they had, coordinating directly with the monarch during emergencies. The elective monarchy was everything the Naboo wanted it to be: idealistic, compassionate, focused on education and welfare, not power. Monarchs like King Varuna, who ruled just before Amidala, and Amidala herself were known for being close to their people and genuinely invested in their well-being. The system produced leaders of real integrity, and it was about to face its greatest test. The thought that a Sith conspiracy could be operating inside their own political system, centered on their own planet, would have been laughable to any Naboo citizen in those years. The galaxy was at peace. The rules were being followed. Everything was fine. Except it was not fine, and the cracks were already forming if you knew where to look. That blind faith in the system was exactly the opening that Sheev Palpatine had been building toward for years. The groundwork had been laid well before Amidala ever sat on the throne. Palpatine had quietly encouraged King Varuna to pursue risky off-world trade agreements, pulling Naboo deeper into relationships with powerful galactic corporations. Those deals made the planet more visible and more dependent on external partners in ways that Varuna probably did not fully appreciate at the time. And when those agreements became controversial, when the political blowback started, Varuna found himself in trouble. Legend sources suggest that Palpatine orchestrated the very scandals that forced Varuna to abdicate the throne. Whether that is confirmed or not, the outcome served Palpatine perfectly. Varuna stepped down. The election that followed put a 14-year-old on the throne. Amidala was brilliant, compassionate, and dedicated. She was also young enough that Palpatine knew she could be guided in the directions he needed. While Palpatine positioned his pieces on Naboo, the Trade Federation was about to give him the crisis he needed. When the Republic Senate passed a new tax on Outer Rim trade routes, the Federation was furious. The tax cut into their profits and threatened their dominance over the shipping lanes they controlled. Palpatine, operating as Darth Sidious, saw his opportunity and took it. He fed the Neimoidians a plan: blockade Naboo, shut down all commerce in and out of the system, and use the crisis to pressure the Senate into repealing the trade tax. The logic was straightforward, and Sidious made it sound reasonable. Naboo sat on the Enarch Run, a key hyperlane that connected major trade routes. Cutting off a planet that exported valuable plasma along that corridor would get the galaxy's attention fast. And because Naboo had almost nothing in the way of real defenses, the blockade could be enforced without resistance. Sidious promised the Neimoidians his full support from the shadows. The Federation bought it completely. They began assembling a fleet of battleships and positioning them for deployment to the Naboo system. And on the ground, life continued as if nothing in the galaxy had changed. Theed's streets were full. The Opera House had performances scheduled. Students attended classes at the university. The entire planet was carrying on with daily life while a fleet powerful enough to conquer it was already on the move. But the storm was coming, and the people who were supposed to be protected by the Republic's promise of peace were about to discover just how empty that promise really was. In 32 BBY, the Trade Federation did what nobody on Naboo believed was possible. They sent a fleet of battleships to the Naboo system and set up a full blockade around the planet. Every incoming and outgoing route was sealed. No ships could land. No ships could leave. Plasma exports stopped overnight. Supply shipments from off-world were turned away. Naboo, a planet that had spent centuries connected to galactic commerce and diplomacy, was suddenly cut off from everything. The blockade Sidious had engineered was now real. Viceroy Newt Gunray followed his instructions to the letter, and when Queen Amidala reached out requesting dialogue, Gunray shut her down completely. There would be no talking. The blockade was a shock, but it was about to get much worse. When the Republic Senate failed to take immediate action against the Federation, the blockade escalated into a full-scale planetary invasion. Trade Federation landing craft descended through the atmosphere and deployed an armored droid army across Naboo's surface. Legions of B-1 battle droids marched into the countryside and headed straight for Theed. The Naboo security forces, the only armed response the planet had, tried to mount a defense. Captain Panaka and his volunteers stood their ground as best they could, but the reality of the situation was overwhelming. The resistance they offered was brave but completely insufficient. Theed fell within hours. Battle droids flooded the streets. Droid tanks rolled across the pastoral countryside that had been untouched by warfare for generations. The elegant capital that the Naboo had spent centuries building was now occupied by a foreign army. Gunray moved into the royal palace and took Queen Amidala and her entire entourage prisoner. Across the planet, the Federation set up detention camps to corral the civilian population and prevent any organized resistance from forming. Even the Gungans were affected. Federation troops occupied the sacred place, a location deep in the swamps that held enormous significance to Gungan culture. The Gungans, threatened by the droid presence, retreated even deeper underwater to stay out of reach. Naboo was an occupied world, controlled entirely by a corporate army, and its people were powerless to stop it. What the Federation did not know was that 2 Jedi Knights were already on the planet when the invasion began. Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi had been sent by the Chancellor to negotiate with the Trade Federation before things escalated. When the droids landed and the Queen was captured, the Jedi intervened. Working quickly and quietly, they reached Amidala and helped her escape from Gunray's custody. The Queen disguised herself as one of her own handmaidens to avoid detection, and the group slipped through the droid cordon with Captain Panaka, several members of her court, and an astromech droid named R2-D2, who had proven critical during their escape. Along the way, they picked up an unlikely addition. Jar Jar Binks, a Gungan outcast who had been living on the fringes of his own society, had crossed paths with the Jedi and ended up joining the group. Together, they made a run for the Queen's royal starship. Breaking through the blockade in orbit was dangerous, but the ship made it past the Federation's battleships and jumped to hyperspace. Amidala was free, but her people were not. The plan was to reach Coruscant and appeal directly to the Galactic Senate for help. On Coruscant, Amidala stood before the full Senate and pleaded for intervention. She described the invasion, the detention camps, the occupation of her capital. She asked the Republic to act, and the Senate did what the Senate was best at in those years. Nothing productive. The debate devolved into bureaucratic arguments and procedural delays. Committees were proposed. Investigations were demanded before any action could be taken. Behind the scenes, Palpatine was quietly stoking the gridlock, making sure that no help reached Naboo while the crisis remained useful to him. Amidala, watching the Senate fail her planet in real time, made a decision that Palpatine had been counting on. Frustrated beyond her breaking point, she called for a vote of no confidence in Supreme Chancellor Valorum. The motion carried. Valorum was removed from office, and in the election that followed, Senator Palpatine of Naboo was chosen as the new Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic. The crisis on his own homeworld had generated exactly the sympathy and political momentum Sidious needed. The people of Naboo, suffering under occupation, had unknowingly handed their greatest enemy the most powerful office in the galaxy. Palpatine made promises. Help is on the way. The Republic will act. But the promises were hollow. He had no intention of sending a task force quickly enough to matter. Amidala saw through the delays. She realized that waiting for the Senate to mobilize would take too long, and that her people could not afford to wait. So the young queen made the boldest decision of her life. She was going back to Naboo. She would fight for her planet herself, with or without the Republic behind her. When Amidala returned to Naboo, the situation on the ground was grim. The Federation had tightened its grip. Officials were being pressured to sign a treaty that would legitimize the occupation under galactic law. Plasma stores were being siphoned by the Federation for their own use. The population was still locked down in camps. There was no organized resistance to speak of. Amidala had brought back a handful of fighters, 2 Jedi, and not much else. Against an entire droid army, it was not enough. She needed more. With guidance from the Jedi, Amidala did something that no Naboo leader had done in thousands of years. She went looking for the Gungans, the two species that had ignored each other for millennia, that had built their entire cultures around staying apart, were going to have to work together or lose everything. Amidala tracked the Gungans to a sacred refuge hidden deep in the swamps. There she came face to face with Boss Rugor Nass, the leader of the Gungan people. And in a moment that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier, the Queen of Naboo dropped to her knees. She knelt before Boss Nass and asked for his help. She acknowledged the centuries of separation and disrespect, and she humbled herself completely. Boss Nass, moved by the gesture and fully aware that the Federation was a threat to Gungans and humans alike, agreed. The alliance was forged. The plan they came up with split the fight across two fronts. The Gungan Grand Army would march out onto the Great Grass Plains and engage the droid forces head-on. Their job was to draw the bulk of the Federation's ground troops away from Theed. While the droids were occupied on the plains, Amidala would lead a strike team into the capital to capture Viceroy Gunray and cut off the Federation's leadership. On the Great Grass Plains, Boss Nass deployed his army in full force. Gungan warriors rode Cardu into formation. Shield generators went up, creating a massive energy barrier that absorbed incoming blaster fire. The Gungans fired back with catapults and atlatls, launching plasma boomers into the advancing droid lines and taking out entire columns at a time. The fighting was intense. The Gungans suffered real losses as the droid army pressed forward in overwhelming numbers. But they held their ground long enough to accomplish their mission. The droids were focused entirely on the plains, which meant the capital was exposed. In Theed, Amidala's strike team moved through the secret underground passages that had been built beneath the city generations ago. They emerged in the Royal Palace hangar, where they rallied the Naboo pilots who had been grounded since the invasion began. The pilots scrambled to their N-1 starfighters and launched into orbit, forming Bravo Squadron to take on the Federation's droid control ship. On the ground, Amidala and her team fought their way through the palace corridors toward the throne room. Using a combination of tactics and misdirection, including her own decoy drawing Federation attention away from the real assault, Amidala reached Gunray and captured him. The head of the occupation force was now a prisoner. Above the planet, Bravo Squadron engaged the massive droid control ship in a desperate fight. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source imaginable. Young Anakin Skywalker, a boy who had tagged along with the Jedi from Tatooine, had climbed into the cockpit of a starfighter during the chaos. Whether by instinct, luck, or the Force working through him, Anakin flew his ship directly into the control ship's interior and destroyed its reactor core from within. The explosion tore through the vessel and severed the signal that controlled every single battle droid on the planet. Across Naboo, on the Great Grass Plains, and in the streets of Theed, the entire droid army shut down simultaneously. The Federation's invasion was over. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Naboo had experienced. Human citizens poured out of the camps and into the streets of Theed. The Gungan army marched into the capital beside them. For the first time in living memory, the two peoples of Naboo stood together, cheering side by side in a grand parade through the heart of the city. Queen Amidala presented Boss Nass with a luminescent globe of peace, a gesture marking the end of the ancient divide between their civilizations. The moment carried weight far beyond Naboo. It was the first major defeat the Trade Federation had ever suffered, and the first time the two cultures of Naboo had publicly stood as one. But the victory carried a darker undercurrent. During the battle, a figure had appeared on Naboo that shook the Jedi to their core. Darth Maul, Sidious's apprentice, had fought Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi inside the Theed power generator. Qui-Gon was struck down during the fight. Obi-Wan defeated Maul, but the damage was done. The Sith, extinct for 1,000 years as far as anyone knew, had returned, and the Jedi immediately suspected that Maul was not the master. Somewhere in the galaxy, a Sith Lord was still operating in the shadows. The Federation was forced to answer to the Senate for the invasion, though the punishment was embarrassingly mild thanks to the same bureaucratic corruption that had failed Naboo in the first place. Amidala returned to governing her planet, and on Coruscant, the newly elected Chancellor Palpatine was celebrated as a hero who had risen from tragedy to lead the Republic in its time of need. The people of Naboo were proud of their native son. They had no way of knowing that every piece of their suffering, from the blockade to the occupation to the Senate's failure to act, had been designed by that very same man. Naboo's darkest chapter had been manufactured start to finish as a stepping stone for one person's climb to absolute power. The planet was free, but the architect of its pain was now the most powerful person in the galaxy. The Battle of Naboo was over, but the real transformation was just beginning. For thousands of years, the humans and Gungans had lived on the same world and treated each other like strangers at best, enemies at worst. That wall came down in a matter of weeks, and it stayed down. Queen Amidala moved quickly to make the alliance permanent. She issued formal pledges of mutual aid and respect between the Naboo government and the Gungan leadership, turning the wartime partnership into an official relationship that would outlast the crisis. The changes showed up everywhere. Gungans began appearing in the streets of Theed, walking openly through the same avenues where they had once been treated with contempt or disbelief. Naboo citizens who had spent their entire lives thinking of Gungans as primitive swamp creatures were now seeing them as neighbors and partners. In the other direction, Naboo officials traveled beneath the lakes to visit Gungan underwater cities as honored guests for the first time in recorded history. The Gungan Grand Army and the RNSF started sharing intelligence and coordinating on planetary defense planning together, building a joint security framework that the planet had never had. The cultural blending went deeper than politics. New festivals began incorporating traditions from both civilizations, mixing human and Gungan music, dance, and ceremony into shared celebrations. Even the food changed. A dessert called the Plasma Cloud became popular across the planet, fusing Gungan and Naboo culinary traditions into a single dish that practically became a symbol of the new unity. These were small things on their own, but they added up fast. Two societies that had spent millennia pretending the other did not exist were now actively building a shared culture. One figure stood at the center of this transformation. Jar Jar Binks had gone from being a Gungan outcast to playing a critical role in securing the alliance that saved the planet. In recognition of that, Queen Amidala appointed him as the official representative of the Gungans within the Naboo government. This was a position that had never existed before. For the first time, a Gungan had a formal seat at the table in Naboo's political system, and that was only the beginning. Jar Jar was later elevated to serve as a delegate in the Galactic Senate itself, representing Gungan interests on the most powerful legislative stage in the galaxy. No Gungan had ever held anything close to that kind of role. The species that had been invisible to galactic politics for their entire existence now had a voice on Coruscant. While the social healing moved forward, Amidala turned her attention to the physical damage left behind by the invasion. Theed had taken a beating during the occupation. Droid patrols had torn up streets and damaged buildings that had stood for centuries. The Theed spaceport, which had been overwhelmed and damaged during the crisis, was rebuilt and expanded into a state-of-the-art facility designed to handle far more traffic than the old one. The central plaza in the heart of the capital, which had been chewed up by Federation forces, was refurbished from the ground up and temporarily renamed Peace Park. Memorials went up across the planet, monuments honoring the fallen from both the human and Gungan sides of the battle were erected in Theed and in Gungan communities alike. The losses were real, and the Naboo made sure they were remembered. At the same time, an outpouring of patriotic art swept across the planet. Murals appeared on public buildings depicting the unity of the two peoples. New symphonies were composed, celebrating the themes of courage and reconciliation. Poets wrote about the beauty of Naboo and the strength it took to defend it. The artistic community, always central to Naboo's identity, channeled everything the planet had just experienced into work that reflected both the pain and the triumph of the invasion. Economically, Naboo bounced back faster than anyone expected. The blockade had cut off plasma exports for only a brief period, and once trade routes reopened, shipments resumed immediately. In fact, the galaxy's sympathy for what Naboo had endured worked in the planet's favor. Several trading partners offered better terms than before, and the increased attention brought new commercial relationships that strengthened the treasury. The economic disruption that could have set the planet back years ended up being a relatively short interruption. Amidala also pushed through reforms designed to make sure Naboo was never caught that isolated again. She established the Naboo Defense League, a small coordination body that linked the planet's security apparatus with the Republic judicial forces so that future threats could be communicated and responded to faster. Investments were made in improved communications infrastructure to prevent a repeat of the blockade scenario, where Naboo's pleas for help had been too slow reaching the right people. Captain Panaka, who had watched his volunteer force get steamrolled by a droid army, saw to it that the RNSF received better armaments and grew modestly in size. New equipment arrived, training programs were updated. The security force was still small and still volunteer, but it was sharper than it had been before the invasion. With Palpatine now leading the Republic, the political transitions that followed reshuffled Naboo's representation in the Senate. Palpatine had technically still held Naboo's Senate seat even after becoming Chancellor, but his new duties forced him to vacate it. Queen Amidala appointed Jar Jar Binks as the planet's assistant senator, a representative who would work alongside whoever filled the primary seat. Meanwhile, Amidala's own time on the throne was running out. Naboo's constitution limited monarchs to 2 terms, and when her service as queen ended, she transitioned into a new role. By 25 BBY, Padme Amidala had been selected as Naboo's senator, stepping into the seat that Palpatine had left behind. The result was a remarkable alignment of power. The Chancellor of the Galactic Republic was from Naboo. The senator representing the Chomel sector was from Naboo. 2 of the most influential figures in galactic politics came from the same small mid-rim world. Naboo's voice in the Senate had never carried more weight. But behind the scenes, the galaxy was already shifting in directions that the people of Naboo could not see. Darth Sidious had lost his apprentice Darth Maul during the battle, but he did not remain without one for long. Quietly, he recruited a new pupil. Count Dooku, a former Jedi Master who had grown disillusioned with the Order, became Darth Tyrannus, the next Sith apprentice. While Naboo was celebrating peace and unity, Dooku was traveling the galaxy under Sidious's direction, visiting star systems and rallying political leaders who were unhappy with the Republic. He was building something, a separatist movement, an organized coalition of worlds and corporations that would eventually challenge the Republic itself. Naboo, firmly loyal to the Republic and to Palpatine personally, had no involvement in separatist politics. But the movement Dooku was assembling would eventually drag the entire galaxy into war. One early sign of the danger still lingering arrived around 29 BBY. Newt Gunray, the same viceroy who had led the invasion of Naboo and walked away with barely a punishment from the Senate, attempted to have Padme Amidala assassinated. He wanted revenge for his humiliation during the battle. Naboo security foiled the attempt before it could succeed, but the message was clear. The people who had targeted Naboo once were not finished. Palpatine, meanwhile, was quietly cleaning house on his homeworld. Rumors circulated that he had ordered a clandestine operation to erase any evidence connecting him to the Trade Federation or to his true identity as a Sith Lord. Federation officials who had been involved in the invasion and might have known too much about Sidious's role met quiet, unexplained ends. Records were scrubbed, loose threads were tied off. Palpatine was protecting himself with the same cold efficiency he brought to everything else. Naboo, the planet that had given him his start, was being sanitized of anything that could ever trace the crisis back to him. On the surface, everything looked wonderful. The planet was healed. The two peoples were united. The economy was strong. Naboo's most famous citizens held the galaxy's most powerful positions. But the Sith plan had not ended with the invasion. It had only entered its next phase. The Clone Wars changed everything. Across the galaxy, Republic worlds and separatist systems were tearing each other apart in a conflict that stretched from the core to the outer rim. Battlefields opened on dozens of planets simultaneously. Entire civilizations were displaced. And Naboo, sitting in the mid-rim with its beautiful cities and its pacifist traditions, found itself in a position that made it impossible to stay out of the crossfire entirely. The problem was not military. Naboo was not a strategic fortress or a weapons manufacturing hub. There was no tactical reason for the separatists to throw their resources at conquering it. The problem was political. Naboo was the homeworld of Supreme Chancellor Palpatine and one of the most vocal Republic senators in the galaxy, Padme Amidala. That combination made the planet a symbol. Hitting Naboo would send a message directly to the leadership of the Republic, and the separatists knew it. The most terrifying attack came early in the war, around 21 BBY, and it had nothing to do with battle droids or starships. A separatist scientist named Dr. Nuvo Vindi had gotten his hands on something far worse: the Blue Shadow virus. This was an ancient pathogen that had been wiped out long ago, and Vindi had spent years resurrecting it in a hidden laboratory on Naboo itself. His plan was to release the virus into the planet's atmosphere and wipe out every living thing on the surface. Every human, every Gungan, every animal. Total extinction as a political weapon. The plot was discovered just in time. Senator Amidala, Jar Jar Binks, and a team of Jedi Knights tracked Vindi to his facility and shut the operation down before the virus could be deployed. Naboo was saved, but the close call shook the planet to its core. The idea that someone would engineer a biological weapon specifically designed to erase all life on their world was a kind of threat the Naboo had never had to process before. The separatists were not just fighting a war. They were willing to commit total annihilation to make a point. The biological threat was not the only time the war reached Naboo's doorstep. On at least one occasion during the conflict, separatist battle droids launched a surprise assault directly on Theed. Landing craft touched down in the capital and deployed droid forces into the streets before anyone could mount a coordinated response. For the citizens of Theed, the sight of battle droids marching through their city triggered memories of the Federation invasion a decade earlier. The scale was smaller this time, but the fear was just as real. During that particular attack, an unusual figure stepped up. A visiting artist who had been experiencing Force visions helped Senator Amidala evade separatist assassins during the chaos, and even took a blaster shot while protecting her. The RNSF managed to repel the attack with help from Republic clone troopers who were available on the planet at the time. Theed was secured, but the incident proved that even a world as far from the front lines as Naboo could be hit without warning. Through it all, the Naboo government held firm to the values that had defined the planet for centuries. Queen Jamilia, who held the throne during the early stages of the war, and later Queen Nayutni, who succeeded her, both maintained Naboo's humanitarian commitments even while the galaxy burned around them. Theed's doors were open to war refugees from other worlds. People who had been displaced by separatist occupations on their own planets were welcome to settle temporarily on Naboo. Families who had lost everything arrived with nothing and found shelter in a place that still had functioning schools, clean water, and food to share. Senator Amidala returned to Naboo multiple times during the conflict, not just for personal reasons, but for high-stakes diplomatic work. One of the most significant meetings took place at Naboo's Lake Country retreat, where Amidala secretly met with separatist Senator Mina Bonteri to try negotiating an end to the war through back-channel diplomacy. The talks were risky. Meeting with a representative of the enemy government could have been seen as treason by hardliners in the Republic. But Amidala believed that if the politicians on both sides could talk to each other honestly, away from the posturing of the Senate floor, there might be a path to peace. The parley was ultimately unsuccessful. The war was too far gone, and too many powerful interests on both sides needed it to continue. But the fact that Amidala tried, and that she chose Naboo as the meeting ground, said everything about what the planet still represented. A place where people believed in talking first. Naboo's connection to the Chancellor also brought a different kind of attention. Republic security kept a heavy watch on the planet throughout the war. Palpatine visited Theed on several occasions, each time arriving with a security detail that underscored just how high-profile Naboo had become. One of those visits, in 21 BBY, coincided with the annual Festival of Light celebration. What should have been a joyful occasion turned dangerous when separatist agents, led by the notorious bounty hunter Cad Bane, launched an attempt to kidnap the Chancellor during the festivities. The plot was elaborate and well-coordinated, but Anakin Skywalker intervened, and Palpatine was rescued before the scheme could succeed. To the people of Naboo watching these events unfold, it looked like another dramatic rescue by a heroic Jedi, protecting their beloved Chancellor on their own soil. What they could not have known was that the entire incident was almost certainly staged. Palpatine, as Darth Sidious, had likely orchestrated the kidnapping attempt himself as a test of Anakin Skywalker's abilities and loyalty. The danger to the Chancellor was never real. The danger to Anakin's independence was. Palpatine was pulling the young Jedi closer to him with every manufactured crisis, building the trust and emotional dependence that would eventually turn Skywalker to the dark side. Naboo's own Festival of Light was being used as a stage for Sith manipulation, and nobody on the planet had any idea. One smaller but notable event from late in the war involved a Force-sensitive Gungan child named Ruru Page. The Separatists had targeted the child, and Senator Amidala entrusted Jar Jar Binks with keeping Ruru safe on Naboo. The fact that the planet was chosen as a sanctuary for a vulnerable child speaks to the role Naboo played during the war. It was not a battleground. It was a safe harbor, a place people sent things they wanted to protect. And that is ultimately the story of Naboo during the Clone Wars. The planet was never occupied. Its cities never fell. Its fields never became prolonged war zones. Every attack that reached the planet was repelled, and every scheme aimed at it was foiled before it could do lasting damage. Through a combination of skill, good fortune, and the dedication of people like Amidala and the RNSF, Naboo came through the deadliest conflict in recent galactic history, with its way of life largely intact. But the war touched Naboo in quieter ways that did not make the headlines. Families sent their sons and daughters off to join the Republic military or work with relief organizations on devastated worlds. The economy swung with wartime disruptions as trade routes became unstable and galactic commerce stuttered. And underneath everything, there was a constant low-grade fear that followed every citizen around. The knowledge that what was happening on other planets, the bombardments, the sieges, the occupations, could happen here too. Naboo had already lived through one invasion. The possibility of another one kept people awake at night. In 19 BBY, the Clone Wars ended, but the peace that followed was nothing like what the people of Naboo had hoped for. Chancellor Palpatine stood before the Galactic Senate and declared the Republic dead. In its place, he announced the birth of a new galactic empire with himself as emperor. The democratic government that Naboo had joined centuries earlier, the one they had celebrated every year during the Festival of Light, was gone overnight, and the man who destroyed it was one of their own. That news alone would have been enough to shake Naboo to its foundations, but it arrived alongside something far more personal. Senator Padme Amidala was dead. Her body was brought home to Theed by Bail Organa shortly after the Empire's rise. The official explanation, crafted by Palpatine himself, claimed that Padme had been struck down by Jedi traitors during a supposed uprising against the Republic. The story painted the Jedi as the villains and Palpatine as the leader who had saved the galaxy from their betrayal. On Naboo, where Padme had been queen before she was senator, the grief was overwhelming. Thousands of citizens lined the streets of Theed carrying flowers as a somber funeral procession carried her body through the capital. She looked as though she was sleeping, her face peaceful as she was taken to her final resting place. The woman who had come to represent everything Naboo believed in was gone. Naboo had lost the leader who had come to represent everything they believed in. The combination of Padme's passing and the fall of the Republic left the population reeling. Confusion and sorrow settled over the planet. And yet, because Palpatine was a native son, someone the Naboo had trusted for decades, many citizens initially accepted his leadership as emperor. They were grieving and disoriented, and the familiar face at the top of the new government offered a sense of continuity, even as everything else changed. Not everyone on Naboo accepted the new order quietly. The planet's reigning queen at the dawn of the Empire was Apailana, a young monarch who had strong pro-Republic sympathies and even harbored feelings of loyalty toward the Jedi. She honored Padme's memory openly and privately distrusted every word of the Empire's official story. Apailana went further than mere skepticism. She began providing secret sanctuary to surviving Jedi Knights who were fleeing the galaxy-wide purge that followed the Empire's rise. These Jedi, hunted across every system, found hidden refuge on Naboo under the protection of its queen. Word of these acts of defiance reached Imperial intelligence, and Naboo quickly became what authorities classified as an irritant, a world that was not openly rebelling, but was clearly not falling in line. Palpatine's patience with his homeworld lasted about a year. In 18 BBY, the Emperor decided to make an example of Naboo. He sent Darth Vader and the elite 501st Legion of Imperial stormtroopers to force the planet's compliance. At the same time, an Imperial Inquisitor named Malorum arrived on Naboo with a separate mission. Malorum was hunting for information about Padme Amidala's offspring. The Empire suspected that Padme had given birth before she passed, and Malorum had been tasked with finding the children. His investigation brought him into direct conflict with the people of Naboo, who were working to protect exactly those secrets. What followed was the Battle of Theed during the Imperial era, a violent confrontation that most of the galaxy never heard about. Queen Apailana's royal security forces, joined by brave Gungan fighters who had answered the call, launched an ambush against the newly established Imperial garrison in the capital. The goal was to buy time, to protect the Jedi in hiding, and to stop Malorum from uncovering what he was looking for. The fighting was fierce but short. A former Jedi named Ferrus Olin intervened during the battle and managed to take down Malorum, ending that particular threat. Naboo resistance fighters destroyed the Imperial base's hangar in the assault, briefly liberating Theed from direct Imperial control. The victory lasted days at most. The Empire's response was swift and ruthless. Vader's stormtroopers stormed back into Theed in a full crackdown. Their primary target was Queen Apilana herself. In a skirmish at the Royal Palace, the 501st Legion found her. Apilana and the handful of Jedi she had been sheltering were all taken down. The Resistance was crushed at its leadership core. Naboo's defiant young queen, who had risked everything to protect people the Empire wanted erased, was gone. Palpatine moved immediately to lock the planet down. He installed a new monarch, Queen Calantha, on the throne. Calantha was considered sympathetic to Imperial rule, someone who would follow directives without causing problems. To make sure the message was clear, Palpatine also elevated a familiar figure to oversee Naboo's governance. Quash Panaka, the same man who had once served as captain of Padme Amidala's royal guard, had demonstrated his loyalty to the Emperor. Palpatine promoted him to the rank of Moff, the Imperial governor responsible for the entire Naboo sector. The man who had once protected Naboo's greatest queen was now enforcing the will of the Emperor, who had destroyed everything she stood for. Under the new arrangement, Naboo's freedoms were systematically curtailed. Free speech was limited. Off-world travel was restricted. Any expression of pro-Republic sentiment was suppressed. But Palpatine understood his homeworld well enough to know that heavy-handed occupation alone might spark the kind of widespread rebellion he wanted to avoid. So he pursued a subtler approach alongside the restrictions. Publicly, Naboo received special treatment as the Emperor's homeworld. Palpatine funneled funds into building projects on the planet. Heavy industrialization was kept away from Naboo's landscape, preserving the natural beauty that had always defined it. The planet was turned into a kind of imperial showcase, a place the Empire could point to as evidence of its benevolent rule. Theed's grand avenues, built centuries earlier to celebrate unity and peace, were repurposed for imperial military parades on Empire Day. Stormtrooper legions marched down streets lined with banners bearing Palpatine's face. Massive statues of the Emperor were erected in the capital. His holographic image loomed over public squares, delivering speeches about the glory of the new order. The locals were expected to stand and cheer. Palpatine visited Theed in person on multiple occasions, usually around Empire Day anniversaries, sometimes with Darth Vader at his side. Each visit was carefully staged, part celebration, part intimidation, a reminder that the Emperor was one of them, but also that he owned them. Naboo's young people were actively recruited into Imperial institutions. The Imperial Academy and the Imperial Mission, organizations that blended military service and charitable work with propaganda, courted Naboo's students. Many joined. Some did it out of genuine belief in the Empire. Others did it because it was the practical choice in a galaxy where resisting could get your family flagged. Throughout the 2 decades of Imperial rule, an undercurrent of nostalgia for the Republic lingered beneath the surface of Naboo's society. People remembered what things had been like before, but outright rebellion was dangerous, and for most of that period, the Empire's grip was tight enough to keep dissent from reaching critical mass. That did not mean resistance disappeared entirely. As the Rebel Alliance began gaining strength across the galaxy, a Naboo underground emerged as well. Acts of defiance ranged from guerrilla strikes against Imperial targets to symbolic protests meant to keep the flame of resistance alive. In 0 ABY, the same year the Rebel Alliance destroyed the first Death Star at the Battle of Yavin, a rebel cell on Naboo, known as the Mummers, carried out a bombing against an Imperial facility in Theed. The Empire cracked down hard on suspects, but the attack proved that Naboo's spirit of freedom had survived 2 decades of occupation. Everyday life under Imperial rule grew steadily grimmer as the years passed. High taxes were imposed to fund the Empire's war machine, draining the treasury that plasma exports had once filled. Speaking of plasma, the Empire requisitioned a significant portion of Naboo's output for its own use, effectively seizing control of the resource that had powered the planet's economy for centuries. Naboo's businessmen and miners resented the arrangement deeply, but challenging it was not an option. Stormtroopers stationed on the planet carried out occasional heavy-handed enforcement actions that left no doubt about who was really in charge. One thing Palpatine did do was shield Naboo from the absolute worst of what the Empire inflicted on other worlds. He would never have considered using the Death Star on his own homeworld the way Alderaan was targeted. But that protection came from possessiveness, not compassion. Naboo was his childhood home, his political launching pad, his showcase. The people were expected to show gratitude for his so-called benevolent stewardship, and the fact that they were being spared the Empire's cruelest weapons was framed as a gift rather than what it actually was: control dressed up as kindness. Then, in 4 ABY, the galaxy changed again. Emperor Palpatine was destroyed at the Battle of Endor. The second Death Star was gone. The Imperial fleet was in chaos, and the news reached Naboo. The response was immediate. Citizens poured into the streets of Theed in a wave of emotion that had been building for 20 years. Shock gave way to disbelief, and disbelief gave way to celebration. In scenes that were captured by rebel news reports and broadcast across the galaxy, ordinary Naboo citizens tore down the statues of Palpatine that had stood over their city for 2 decades. The images of those massive monuments toppling in the capital's plaza became iconic. Everything the people of Naboo had been forced to swallow, every parade they had been made to cheer for, every speech they had been forced to listen to, came crashing down in stone and metal. The uprising that followed was remarkably peaceful. Naboo's population and remaining local security forces came together to push out the Imperial remnants on the planet. The stormtroopers and Imperial officials, now cut off from Central Command and facing overwhelming popular rejection, either surrendered or fled. The transition happened within days. One factor that made the liberation smoother was the absence of Moff Panaka, who had passed away in 3 ABY, according to some sources. His absence left a power vacuum in the Imperial leadership on Naboo that nobody had filled, making organized resistance from the occupiers nearly impossible. By the time representatives of the Rebel Alliance's successor organization, the Alliance of Free Planets that would soon become the New Republic, arrived on Naboo, they found a world that had already freed itself. Princess Leia Organa traveled to Naboo shortly after the events at Endor. She met with Queen Saruna and received a deeply personal gift: Amidala's Japor snippet, a small carved pendant that connected the Skywalker family to Naboo across generations. For Leia, who was only just beginning to learn the full truth about her mother, the moment carried enormous weight. For Naboo, it was a passing of something sacred, a piece of their most beloved leader entrusted to her daughter. Naboo eagerly joined the new galactic order that rose from the ashes of the Empire. The planet that had entered the Republic over 800 years earlier was now stepping into a new era once again. The statues were down, the parades were over, and the people of Naboo, who had endured invasion, occupation, and 2 decades of Imperial rule, were finally free to be themselves again. Naboo did not wait to be invited into the new galactic order. The planet was among the first worlds in the galaxy to formally align with the Alliance of Free Planets, the organization that grew directly out of the Rebel Alliance's victory at Endor. Naboo's ambassadors signed the Common Charter of the Alliance, a founding document that committed its signatories to democracy and liberty. When the alliance formalized into the New Republic, Naboo was already there, ready to participate in building something that felt like what they had lost 2 decades earlier. The monarchy continued, as it always had, but now it served a republic once more. A new queen represented the Chomel sector in the New Republic Senate, stepping into a role that carried echoes of every leader Naboo had sent to Coruscant before. The planet's government picked up right where it had left off before the Empire, functioning under the same elective system and the same values that had guided it for centuries. The only difference now was the scars, and Naboo moved quickly to erase the visible ones. Theed was stripped of every imperial symbol that had been forced onto it. The banners came down. The remaining statues were removed. The grand avenues that had been hijacked for military parades were returned to the citizens who had been forced to line them and clap. The classic architecture that had defined the capital since Jaffan's era was restored to its original state, and within a few years, the city looked like it had never been touched by the Empire at all. Naboo's visual beauty, the thing that had drawn tourists from the core worlds and inspired artists for generations, was back. The galaxy noticed. People began pointing to Naboo as a living symbol of what the New Republic was supposed to represent. A world that had survived tyranny and come out the other side with its identity intact. The years following Endor were chaotic across most of the galaxy. Imperial holdouts fought rearguard actions against the New Republic on dozens of fronts. Warlords carved out personal empires from the scraps of Palpatine's regime, but Naboo remained secure through all of it. The New Republic maintained both a diplomatic and defensive presence on the planet, and no major Imperial warlord made a serious attempt to retake it. Even during Grand Admiral Thrawn's campaign in 9 ABY, widely considered the most dangerous Imperial counteroffensive of the post-Endor period, Naboo was firmly noted as a New Republic stronghold. The planet was safe, prosperous, and at peace. Theed hosted New Republic events and festivals that reaffirmed galactic unity, and for the first time in 20 years, the people of Naboo could celebrate without looking over their shoulders. During this period, the planet had to reckon with the legacies of its 2 most famous children, and the way Naboo handled each one said everything about who they were as a people. Padme Amidala was venerated. Statues went up across the planet, honoring her as a historic heroine. Academies were dedicated in her name. The Royal House of Learning in Theed added an entire new wing called the Padme Amidala Wing, designed to inspire future generations in the civic virtues she had lived by. The woman who had been queen at 14, who had united the Gungans and the humans in the middle of an invasion, who had spent her Senate career fighting for peace while the galaxy was manipulated into war, was given the recognition her story deserved. Naboo made sure that every young person who passed through its schools would know her name and understand what she had stood for. Palpatine was a harder conversation. The feelings on Naboo were complicated in ways that took years to sort through. Many citizens had initially felt pride that one of their own had risen to lead the Republic. That pride curdled into a sense of betrayal once the full scope of his tyranny became clear. Posthumously, the dominant view on Naboo came to regard Palpatine with deep sorrow and disapproval. He was the man who corrupted the Republic and turned the galaxy into a prison for 2 decades. The planet that had given him his start wanted nothing more to do with his memory. But the debate was not entirely one-sided. Some older Naboo, particularly those who had lived comfortably under Imperial rule, and benefited from the special treatment Palpatine had directed toward his homeworld, defended parts of his legacy. They pointed to the building projects, the economic protection, the fact that Naboo had been spared the worst of what the Empire inflicted on other worlds. These arguments caused real political friction in the years following liberation. Over time, though, the majority view won out. Naboo decided that Padme Amidala, not Palpatine, was the true embodiment of their planet's soul. She represented what Naboo wanted to be. He represented what had happened when Naboo's trust was abused by someone who never deserved it. What is remarkable about the decades and centuries that followed is how consistently Naboo avoided becoming a battleground again. The galaxy kept finding new reasons to fight, and Naboo kept finding ways to stay out of it. During the Yuuzhan Vong War, between 25 and 30 ABY, an extragalactic alien force invaded the galaxy on a scale that dwarfed anything the Clone Wars had produced. Entire worlds fell. Populations were displaced by the millions. The Vong pushed deep into Republic territory, hitting worlds closer and closer to the core. But they bypassed much of the mid-rim in their advance, and Naboo was never directly attacked. The planet avoided occupation entirely. That did not mean the Naboo ignored the crisis. Refugees from devastated worlds found haven on Naboo once again, and the planet offered what aid it could. Later, during the Second Galactic Civil War, around 40 ABY, which saw the rise and fall of Jacen Solo and the fracturing of the Galactic Alliance, Naboo once again stayed out of the fighting. The planet remained firmly aligned with the Galactic Alliance, the successor state to the New Republic, but it was not a site of conflict. No battles were fought on its surface, no fleets clashed in its orbit. Naboo's enduring peace during these periods spoke to two things. First, the planet had no major shipyards, military installations, or strategic infrastructure that would make it a high-value target. Second, and perhaps more importantly, there seemed to be a lingering respect for what Naboo represented. Even the galaxy's worst actors found little profit in destroying a world known primarily for its art, its culture, and its commitment to peace. Naboo's cultural influence continued to ripple outward in ways that most people would never have expected. One small but telling example turned up as late as 41 ABY. Grand Admiral Gilad Pellaeon, one of the last great commanders of the Imperial Remnant, was known to spend his leisure time playing Theed Quoits. This was a traditional Nabooian game, a ring toss pastime that had been played on the planet for generations. The image of a hardened Imperial military leader unwinding with a Naboo parlor game says something about how far the planet's genteel culture had spread. Even people who had spent their careers on the opposite side of galactic politics had absorbed a piece of Naboo into their daily lives. The story stretches even further forward. In the Legacy era, over a century after the events of the original Star Wars films, around 137 ABY, Naboo was still there. Its people still remembered their history. The galaxy had changed dramatically by then. A new Sith Empire under Darth Krayt had seized control, and the political landscape looked nothing like the Republic or the Empire that Naboo's citizens would have recognized. But even under Krayt's rule, the spirit of the planet held. Naboo's citizens secretly supported the rival Fel Empire, the political heirs to the Skywalker and Solo legacy, the very families that had deep roots in Naboo's own history. These allegiances had to be kept hidden under the Sith Empire's watch, but they were there. Over 100 years after Padme Amidala had walked the streets of Theed, the people living in those same streets were still choosing the same side she would have chosen. Enlightened leadership, democratic values, the belief that power should serve the people who grant it. That is the story of Naboo, a planet that started as an unexplainable geological oddity, with plasma running through its veins and monsters swimming in its depths. A world where two civilizations grew up side by side without ever learning to trust each other, until an invasion forced them to stand together or lose everything. A place that gave the galaxy one of its greatest heroes in Padme Amidala, and one of its greatest villains in Sheev Palpatine, and then had to live with the consequences of both. A planet that was blockaded, invaded, occupied, manipulated, and mourned. and came through all of it still believing that art matters more than weapons, that talking is better than fighting, and that the people should choose who leads them. Over 1,000 years of recorded history, and Naboo never stopped being Naboo. That might be the most remarkable thing about it.